Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to poem number 3 of the Seadrift section of Leaves of Grass. Of the 11 poems, this is number 3. This one is called Tears. And in some ways, we're going to mention Homer, we're going to mention Shakespeare here. And I think, guys, I've said this to you before, I think that Whitman is having a lot of fun in Leaves of Grass. And I think a poem like this, which is often not really studied very much, I think is actually kind of significant for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about. Hey, do you guys remember when we talked about the Odyssey at learnstrong.net? We have the full lectures of all the books of the Odyssey. Remember Odyssey 5? That we are looking for the very first sighting of Odysseus, and there he is sitting on his rock on the island of Calypso, and what is he doing? We are told by the poet Homer, he's crying, okay? When we finish this lecture, we'll move from Homer to Shakespeare, and we'll play the same game. In some ways, we're going to come back to this notion of the crying hero, and here we're going to have almost like confessional poetry of a kind that we'll talk about. Now, our assumptions, just a second ago I mentioned it, is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and you've been with us for everything from inscriptions all the way up through and including our introductory set of comments for Seadrift, and then finally Ebbed, the poem that we just worked with. Now, as we are often wont to do, we come back to our Nortons for some background information. The poem Tears was one of 7 new poems added to Leaves of Grass in 1867 when it appeared as number 2 of a Leaves of Grass cluster. In 1872-76, it was transferred to the new Seashore Memories group of Passage to India. In the fundamental metrical principle in Whitman's poetry, a scholar named Bradley has analyzed the remarkable accentual symmetry of this poem, and we will certainly point that out as well. Now, let's just enjoy the rhythms of the poem. Let's read and then we'll exegete. Tears, tears, tears in the night, in solitude, tears on the white shore dripping, dripping, sucked in by the sand, tears, not a star shining, all dark and desolate, moist tears from the eyes of a muffled head. Oh, who is that ghost, that form in the dark with tears? What shapeless lump is that bent, crouched there on the sand, streaming tears, sobbing tears, throes, choked with wild cries. Oh, storm, embodied, rising, careening with swift steps along the beach. Oh, wild and dismal night shore with wind. Oh, belching and desperate. Oh, shade so sedate and decorous by day, with calm countenance and regulated pace. But away at night as you fly, none looking. Oh, then the unloosened ocean of tears, tears, tears. Now, of course, we're following in a poetic tradition that is lugubrious, mournful, sad. And of course, we've already mentioned this with the study of the previous 2 Seadrift poems. By the way, the first use of the word tears in Leaves of Grass is Song of Myself, passage 7. Do you remember it? We've already worked with these lines. For my lips that have smiled, eyes that have shed tears. By the way, do notice this is almost a sonnet at 13 lines. 12 times the word tears gets used in these 13 lines. Repetition is obviously a part of it. We'll begin with the idea of threes. Notice all the trinities in Leaves of Grass. I think he learned some of this from his study of Plato and St. Augustine. 3 times with exclamation points. We've seen the use of the exclamation point already and to be in our study. In the night, and obviously there's a whole lot that's been spoken of in the night. That night versus the day and the symbolism that's involved there. In solitude, we've seen this already in the 2 poems that were a part of Seadrift's already. This idea of alone, being alone, solitude, and then back to the word tears. Again, this repetition what gives that beautiful rhythm. On the white shore, dripping, and then the repetition of the same word, dripping, sucked in by the sand. By the way, notice this sucked in as opposed to sucked down. It's interesting the preposition of in being used here. Tears, one more time, not a star shining, and the idea of no hope, right? And again, we mentioned Shakespeare. We're going to come back to Sonnet 29 in a little bit, but you'll remember in Sonnet 116, it's the star to every wandering bark. In other words, There's no star. There's no way to guide. There's no hope, we might say. All dark and desolate. You'll remember the use of this word desolate from starting from Paumanok, passage 5. Then we're to moist tears. Remember this word moist, because we'll come back to it when we do Learned Astronomer. Moist tears from the eyes of a muffled head. You'll maybe remember muffled from Song of the Redwood Tree, number 1, muffled shriek. Oh, and now we're going to get some repetitions of the word oh here. 6 times we're going to get this. Oh, who is that ghost? And of course, the minute that you hear this, it's going to take us back, and Whitman's readers would immediately go back to the opening scene of Shakespeare's Hamlet, no question. You'll maybe remember from Pioneers, O Pioneers as well, ages back in ghostly, that phrase, you'll see it, you go back and look at it, right? That whole idea of the ghosts that are standing behind us and are not smiling but rather frowning. Oh, who is that ghost? That form in the dark with tears. It's almost as if Whitman likes to do this like he did in Song of Myself 5, where he steps outside of himself and looks back at himself. What shapeless lump is that? Bent, crouched there on the sand, and the minute we see imagery like this, it takes us back to, again, not just to Odysseus, but as any number of other heroes, right? Streaming tears, sobbing tears, throes choked with wild cries, this idea of being stifled. I can't express what I want to express. Oh, storm, embodied, rising, careening with swift steps along the beach. The rising of the storm. This could obviously be a certain notion of creativity, we might say. Oh, wild and dismal night storm with wind. Oh, belching and desperate. By the way, this word belching will come back one other time into a locomotive in winter. The word desperate, you'll remember from our reading together of Song of the Open Road, passage 13. And go back and analyze 13 again from Open Road and see how it plays here. Oh, shade, earlier it was ghost, right? So sedate and decorous by day. By the way, this word sedate only gets used one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's here. With calm countenance and regulated pace, I find myself thinking about all those images that we have of Whitman, and when we look at his face, it usually is that very calm countenance. But what is he telling us? But away at night, as you fly, none looking. Oh, then the unloosened ocean of tears, tears, tears. The idea that there's 2 Whitmans. There's 2 of me, he says. There's this image of me that everyone kind of sees as being calm, cool, and collected, and then there's this other side of me. And at 2a, just to finish, well, what are we going to say here? Well, even really confident people, even people who are so sure of themselves, this poem suggests, struggle with self-doubt, with uncertainties. At 2b, of course, the rhythms here are quite remarkable. This is a fun poem to read out loud. I recommend, as I've said to you guys before, take your copy of Leaves of Grass and go out somewhere alone and read it out loud to just enjoy it. At 3a, the idea of confessional poetry, I think that Whitman is not just playing with his Homer. I think he's playing with Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. Do you guys remember this? When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I've given a full lecture on this at learnstrong.net. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed. Do you see that, like him, and we saw that in our poem, that repetition. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. It could be a line lifted directly from some of the lines we've read in Leaves of Grass. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, happily, you'll remember how the poem ends, I think on the blah, 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 blah. I think there's also some of the psalm going on here, and I mentioned this confessional poetry. Of course, biblical readers, and those were almost all the readers of Leaves of Grass, would have some resonances with the book of Psalms itself. And there are all of these confessional poems by the poet, whether it be David or some other. You'll remember in Psalm 113, how long, O Lord, wilt thou wilt thou forget me? How long shalt thou hide thy face from me? This notion of I'm in tremendous pain and I don't have any relief. I don't have any succor. I have no help. I wish that I could have help. At 3b, we're trying to own a text like this. This is not hard for most readers to answer a question like this. When was the last time that you were this sad, that you were this distraught? And how did you get through that experience, right? I'm reminded of that line from T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Every day we prepare a face to meet the faces that we meet. That notion that we're always kind of hiding something. And we think of Dunbar and his great poem Mask, and we wear the mask. And I think it's easy to ask that question. What about writing about it? Do you find as students, do you find as poets, do you find as thinkers, as artists, that sometimes if you can write about it or you can speak about it, that it in fact helps? It's clear for Whitman that this is a poem that speaks to what happens at night, when he's all alone, when he has those self-doubts. I hope that a poem like this, though in the end, gives us some comfort as well. Thank you.